the most talkative woman in American television, just spent 2 weeks unable to say a single word. Not grounded, not on vacation. Silenced by doctor's orders in the middle of her own show. And here's the part that should stop you cold. It wasn't even the first time Kelly Ripa's voice was taken from her without warning. If you've ever turned on a television before 10 a.m., you know that laugh. That rapid-fire wit that can turn a segment about carb cravings into 5 minutes of comedy gold. For 25 years, Kelly Ripa has been the voice in millions of living rooms, the woman who made mornings feel a little less lonely. But underneath that laughter, underneath the effortless banter with her husband every single morning, there's a version of her story almost nobody talks about. A version where she was blindsided, lived not once but twice by the very people she trusted most on television. A version where the woman famous for never running out of things to say was secretly managing a diagnosed anxiety disorder just to get through the broadcast. And a version where the marriage everyone assumes was a fairy tale actually started with a breakup, a Vegas chapel, and $179 with no flowers to show for it. We're going to get to all three. But to understand why any of it happened the way it did, you have to go back to a small town in New Jersey, decades before anyone knew her name. Kelly Maria Ripa was born on October 2nd, 1970, in Stratford, a tiny borough tucked into Camden County, New Jersey. The kind of place where everybody's parents knew each other and nobody expected to end up on television. Her father, Joseph Ripa, drove a city bus before working his way up through his transit union, eventually becoming its president and, decades later, the elected county clerk of Camden County, a job he'd held for 15 years. Her mother, Esther, stayed home to raise Kelly, and her older sister, Linda, who would grow up to become a children's book author, living a far quieter life outside the spotlight. There was nothing showbiz about that house. It was Italian and Irish, Catholic, working class, the kind of home where dinner happened at the same time every night and college, not Hollywood, was the assumed next step. But Kelly was different from the start. At just 3 years old, she was already enrolled in ballet lessons, twirling in a studio instead of playing with dolls, a habit that stuck long enough that she can still, to this day, pick out a tune on the piano, even if she's the first to joke she's no great singer. At Eastern Regional High School in Voorhees Township, she became a cheerleader, threw herself into the drama program, and caught the attention of a teacher who saw something the rest of the world wouldn't discover for years. It wasn't the loudest energy in the room. It was the most magnetic. She wasn't performing to be noticed. She simply couldn't help being watchable. Here's the detail that won't make sense until decades later. Joseph Ripa's story doesn't end with a bus route and a union office. Long after his daughter became a household name, he found his own strange second act, appearing as a recurring, fan-favorite guest on Kelly's game show Generation Gap, teaching a chicken recipe on national television well into his 80s. The bus driver's daughter had become famous enough to make her own father a minor celebrity. Neither of them saw that coming from a modest house in Camden County. And neither of them could have predicted what came next, either because after graduation, Kelly enrolled briefly at Camden County College, the safe, practical choice. It wouldn't last long. Before Kelly Ripa ever stepped foot on a soap opera soundstage, she was dancing for a paycheck, literally. As a teenager, she landed a spot as a house dancer on the local program Dancing on Air, later rebranded as Dance Party USA, filmed just up the road in Camden. It didn't pay much, but it was her first real taste of a camera pointed directly at her, and something about it clicked hard enough that she left Camden County College behind and started chasing auditions in New York City with more determination than money. It paid off faster than almost anyone expected. In 1990, at just 19 years old, Kelly landed the role of Haley Vaughn on the ABC soap opera All My Children, a part that would anchor over a decade of her career and earn her 3 Daytime Emmy nominations. Soap opera work is grueling, filmed at a breakneck pace and quietly dismissed by the rest of the industry as lesser than primetime. For Kelly, it became the exact opposite. A masterclass in performing live, thinking on her feet, and never once losing her composure on camera. But the real plot twist of those years wasn't on the call sheet. In February of 1995, a young actor named Mark Consuelos was cast opposite her as her on-screen love interest, Mateo Santos. He'd left college in Florida for the part and was, by his own account, essentially broke, crashing on a friend's sofa while the show shot around them. Neither of them knew it yet, but the chemistry the cameras were capturing between Haley and Mateo wasn't entirely fiction. For years, the two kept playing out a screen romance while a real one quietly built itself in the background, two young actors falling for each other in front of an audience that had no idea it was watching something true. Kelly stayed on All My Children for 12 years total, leaving in 2002 to chase a very different opportunity, then returning briefly in 2010 for the show's 40th anniversary, a nod to the role that had given her a career in the first place. 3 Daytime Emmy nominations for Outstanding Younger Actress came out of that run, official recognition for a genre the rest of the industry too often treated as background noise between the morning shows and the primetime lineup. For Kelly, it was never background noise. It was the training ground. But the real test of who Kelly Ripa was wouldn't come from a soap opera at all. It would come 5 years later when a psychic accidentally leaked her pregnancy live on national television, and somehow that chaos is exactly what got her the job of a lifetime. By the year 2000, Kelly's reputation as a quick, funny, entirely unscripted presence had made its way to ABC executives who were quietly searching for a permanent replacement to sit beside the legendary Regis Philbin on his long-running morning show. During her guest tryout, a psychic brought on as a segment guest blurted out, live on air, that Kelly was pregnant with her second child, a detail she hadn't even told her own boss yet. It was chaotic, unplanned, and completely, unmistakably Kelly. Weeks later, the permanent job was hers. In February 2001, she officially became Philbin's co-host, and the program was renamed Live with Regis and Kelly. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of a perfect decade. But years later, in her own memoir, Kelly revealed a detail that stung far more than any tabloid headline ever could. Producers had insisted her name appear on the show's title card in a noticeably smaller typeface than his. A small thing. Printed letters on the studio wall. But it captured something much larger about the years she'd spent proving she belonged in that chair, years she later described as coming with a warning to always remember who her boss was, and privileges the men beside her simply received without a second thought. She didn't stop there. Throughout the 2000s, Kelly co-starred in the ABC sitcom Hope and Faith from 2003 to 2006, ironically playing an out-of-work former soap star, and launched a production company, Milo Joe, alongside her husband, a rare case of a daytime host actually owning a piece of what she helped build, instead of just clocking in for it. By 2012, The Hollywood Reporter named her one of the most powerful people in media. She'd go on to earn 4 Daytime Emmy Awards as a host, twice alongside Philbin, and twice alongside her next co-host, Michael Strahan. It's easy to forget, watching the show today, that the format itself traces back to a local New York program from the late 1970s, decades before Kelly was even old enough to audition for anything. By the time she arrived, she wasn't just joining a talk show. She was inheriting one of the longest-running formats in American television, and she'd end up hosting more hours of it than anyone else who ever sat in that chair, longer than Philbin himself managed in the same seat. For over a decade from the audience's chair, everything looked stable. Everything looked earned, warm, permanent. Then, on a single Tuesday morning, all of that stability collapsed in 20 minutes flat. And it would happen to her twice. Before we get to that, it's worth understanding what Kelly was actually protecting during all of it, because her home life was never the polished, easy fairy tale the tabloids like to sell. Her love story with Mark Consuelos began exactly the way a soap opera might write it, two young actors falling for each other while playing characters who were already falling for each other on screen. The real version had far more stumbles than the scripted one. In the middle of dating, the two actually broke up entirely, splitting apart just days before what would eventually become their wedding. A joint appearance on a Mother's Day special reignited things almost instantly, and over pizza and wine one night at Mark's apartment, he suggested they skip the long engagement altogether and just go. On May 1st, 1996, they eloped to Las Vegas. The entire ceremony cost them $179. There were no flowers, a detail Kelly has admitted she still regrets 3 decades later, joking that her hands looked permanently awkward in every wedding photo because she had nothing to hold. For a while, almost no one on the set of All My Children even knew the two were legally married. Mark was still crashing on his co-star's couch, and the marriage stayed hidden underneath the fictional relationship they were still filming every day, a secret they kept quietly enough that colleagues went months without realizing their on-screen love story had a real one running right alongside it. Their first year together was, by Kelly's own admission, genuinely difficult. They fought constantly, still figuring out how to build something real out of something that had technically started as make-believe. Decades later, the two would joke on their own show that they barely had any real data on each other before getting married, a bit that only landed because, somehow, against the odds, it actually lasted. They stayed together long enough to welcome 3 children, Michael, Lola, and Joaquin, and to build a life split between a Manhattan apartment and a quieter home outside the city. Mark went on to build his own career well beyond the soap world, eventually spending 6 seasons playing Hiram Lodge on the CW's Riverdale, even as he kept returning to guest host beside his wife whenever the schedule allowed, long before the job officially became his. By 2021, with Joaquin off to college, they'd become full empty nesters. In May of 2026, they celebrated a full 30 years of marriage, a milestone Mark has credited in part to advice passed down from his own late father. Along the way, there was a health scare too, one Kelly rarely talks about without a joke attached. Back in 1997, she collapsed unexpectedly during a private moment with her husband, the result of 2 ruptured ovarian cysts, and woke up in a hospital bed. She's since described it with her trademark humor, rather than the fear it clearly must have caused in the moment. She's also spoken openly, if self-deprecatingly, about a lifelong sensitivity to certain sounds, particularly the sound of people eating, something reported on for years as an eccentric quirk long before the term misophonia entered the mainstream. That's who Kelly Ripa has always been. Talk about the scary thing first on her own terms, before anyone else gets the chance to. But being married to her best friend, raising 3 kids, building an entire production company together, none of it was armor. Because the biggest blows of Kelly Ripa's career didn't come from her marriage at all. They came from the people she trusted most at work. Here's mistake number 1, the first blindside, and it's worse than most people remember. In November 2011, Kelly and Regis Philbin were closing in on their 10th anniversary as co-hosts, a full decade of on-air chemistry that had, from where the audience was sitting, hardened into genuine friendship. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday, Philbin announced live on air that he was retiring. Kelly reported he found out roughly 20 minutes before the camera started rolling. Not weeks before. Not days before. 20 minutes. She was visibly stunned on camera, fighting to keep the broadcast moving while processing news that would have floored anyone, and afterward she took a brief, quiet hiatus from the show entirely. Here's the part that makes it sting even more. Kathy Lee Gifford, Philbin's previous co-host, later admitted she'd known about the retirement for weeks, the two of them discussing it openly over regular dinners, while Kelly, the woman sitting beside him every single day, was kept completely in the dark. Philbin would later say she seemed to believe he'd left because of her. He insisted it was just about getting older. Whatever the truth was, the friendship the audience had watched for a decade never fully recovered in public view. That's blindside number 1. The second one is almost worse because it means she'd already lived through this exact nightmare once before. Just 5 years later, in April 2016, it happened again. This time it was Michael Strahan, her co-host since 2012, announcing he was leaving to join Good Morning America full-time. Once again, Kelly reportedly wasn't told in advance. Once again, the news broke to her almost exactly the way it had with Philbin, minutes instead of days. She was so blindsided that she skipped her own show for several days afterward, an almost unheard-of move for a woman who had built her entire brand on always showing up. ABC's own network president would later publicly admit the situation had been mishandled. Strahan, for his part, would later say only that he'd started to feel more like a sidekick than a genuine partner by the end, and that certain things happening behind the scenes had simply caught up with them. Twice in 5 years. The industry she'd given her entire career to let her learn about her own show's future secondhand, live in real time, alongside the audience watching at home. And here's the twist: almost nobody knew until years later. All of that composure on camera, through both blindsides, through decades of unscripted live television, wasn't as effortless as it looked. In her 2022 memoir Live Wire, Kelly finally admitted something that surprised even longtime viewers who felt like they knew her. She lives with a genuine diagnosed social anxiety disorder, one she said could cause her to blurt out awkward or inappropriate things under pressure. For a woman whose entire livelihood depended on staying composed in front of a live audience every single morning, that revelation quietly reframed decades of performances that had always looked completely effortless. It hadn't been effortless at all. It had been managed carefully, take after take, year after year, in front of an audience who had no idea anything was being managed in the first place. You'd think writing that book, finally setting the record straight on her own terms, would have brought relief. Instead, it brought a backlash she never saw coming. Her candid recollection of the tension behind the scenes with Philbin, who had passed away 2 years earlier and could no longer respond, drew criticism from people who felt she was speaking ill of a beloved legend who wasn't around to defend himself. Kathy Lee Gifford herself publicly declined to even read the book. Kelly stayed mostly quiet about the backlash, later admitting only that the Philbin chapters had been the hardest ones to write, that she wished she'd corrected the record while he was still alive to hear it, and that she'd trusted the people around her rather than setting things straight in real time. When asked directly whether the criticism had followed her, her answer was blunt. She said she still felt like a target years later. Even her openness about her food routine, shared candidly on air over the years, has at times drawn public scrutiny online, viewers questioning a personal habit she only ever meant to share honestly, alongside an unrelated moment when her own annual blood work came back with high insulin numbers, something else she chose to explain to her audience rather than quietly handle in private. For a woman who talks for a living, Kelly Ripa has spent a surprising amount of her life being talked about, judged, and silenced in ways she never actually chose for herself. At this point, it would be easy to assume the story ends there, in that quiet, guarded exhaustion in a woman who talks for a living, being talked about instead. It doesn't. Despite every blind side, every whispered criticism, and every year the industry seemed to define her only in relation to the men sitting beside her, Kelly Ripa remained the one true constant across 4 decades of American morning television. She is one of the very few daytime hosts in history to survive not one but 3 major co-host transitions, from Philbin to Strahan to Seacrest to her own husband, and come out the other side more popular each time, not less. Her early insistence on producing her own material through Milojo made her one of a small number of women in the 2000s who held genuine ownership behind the camera, not just a paycheck in front of it. Her memoir, whatever controversy it stirred, did something rarer than most celebrity books manage. It pulled back the curtain on exactly how much quiet inequity had gone into building a show the public had simply assumed was easy for her the entire time. She never became a punchline for aging out of daytime television the way so many hosts before her quietly had. Instead, she leaned directly into turning 50 and then 55, joking about both the same self-deprecating way she's joked about nearly everything that ever scared her. Alongside her advocacy work, including her long-running support for Mothers Against Drunk Driving, Kelly built something that outlasted every single co-host lineup change, an audience that trusted her specifically, not just the format or the time slot she happened to be hosting that year. Her decision to eventually hand the co-host chair to her own husband in 2023, rather than another rotating guest star, also set a template other shows would openly study, proof that a format built on chemistry didn't have to be reinvented every few years. It could simply come home. In an industry built on turnover, where hosts are quietly replaced the moment ratings dip, Kelly Ripa simply never left. She absorbed every blow the network dealt her, learned to talk about her own struggles before the tabloids could, and kept the chair with her name on it through 4 completely different television eras. Few people in daytime television can say that. Fewer still can say they did it while raising 3 kids and staying married to their first, unlikely Las Vegas romance the whole time, the same one that started with a breakup, a chapel, and $179. Which brings us back to exactly where we started, to the woman built entirely out of words, standing at the edge of the one thing she was never supposed to lose. In April 2023, Mark officially became Kelly's full-time co-host, and the show was renamed Live with Kelly and Mark, closing a loop that had quietly begun on a soap opera set nearly 3 decades earlier. Their 3 children are grown now, all off building their own adult lives, leaving Kelly and Mark as genuine empty nesters in the same New York City home where they once raised all 3 of them. In May 2026, the couple marked a full 30 years of marriage, a milestone that once again brought Kelly back to that Vegas chapel story, joking on her own show that she still wishes they'd spend the extra money on flowers. And then, this past summer, fate handed Kelly Ripa the strangest twist of her entire career. In late July 2026, she underwent gum graft surgery, and her doctors ordered her not to speak at all while she healed. For close to 2 weeks, her chair on Live sat empty, filled instead by a rotating cast of guest hosts, including Kevin Jonas, Mila Kunis, Pamela Adlon, Sarah Chalker, and Scott Foley, while Mark updated the audience on her recovery each morning. No talking. Soft foods only, not even a straw. The woman who had spent 25 years never once running out of things to say was, for the first time in her career, under strict doctor's orders to stay completely quiet. Even Mark couldn't resist the irony on air, joking that going silent might genuinely be the hardest single thing his wife had ever had to do. Think about that for a second. Twice blindsided into silence by the people she trusted most at work. Decades spent quietly managing an anxiety disorder just to make live television look effortless. And now, at 55, an age she marked back in October 2025 the same way she's marked every hard milestone in her career, with a joke on air rather than a somber reflection, she was silenced one final time. Not by a network executive, not by a co-host's abrupt exit, by her own body, mid-recovery, mid-sentence, mid-career. She has said publicly, more than once, that she doesn't intend to work forever. She'd like to see new talent eventually given the same chance she once had to fight so hard for. But for now, the chair is still hers. The name still comes first on the marquee. And every blindside, every quiet betrayal, every anxious moment hidden behind a well-timed laugh line has only ever seemed to buy her more time in front of the camera, not less. Kelly Ripa never had the kind of tragedy that makes headlines overnight. Hers was quieter than that, built slowly across 25 years of being underestimated, blindsided, and printed in a smaller font, and expected to smile through all of it anyway. But maybe that's exactly why so many people relate to her. Not because her life was perfect, but because she kept showing up to a job that hadn't always been fair to her, morning after morning, decade after decade, even on the mornings it clearly wasn't easy. Do you remember the first time you watched Kelly Ripa on your screen? Was it Regis and Kelly, Kelly and Michael, Kelly and Ryan, or Kelly and Mark? Let us know which era was your favorite and which of these 3 stories surprised you the most in the comments below. And if you want to keep exploring the real, verified stories hiding behind the familiar faces we've watched grow up on our screens, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next one.